The wind, a razor honed on distant peaks, clawed at Ilara's inadequate dress, its fabric already shredded by thorns and jagged rock. Each gust drove the cold deeper, a relentless siege against her failing warmth. Beneath her worn slippers, the ground was an agony of loose scree and treacherous ice, each step a gamble, each stumble a fresh wave of terror. She had been running for what felt like an eternity, fueled by a primal fear that eclipsed hunger, thirst, and the throbbing ache in her ribs where Silas's boot had connected. The towering, indifferent faces of the mountains loomed around her, their snow-dusted summits disappearing into a bruised twilight sky. There was no mercy here, only a vast, crushing emptiness that mirrored the desolation in her soul. To be caught meant a return to a torment she could no longer endure, to remain lost meant a slower, colder demise. The choice was a cruel illusion. Panic, sharp and metallic, flooded her mouth. She pressed a trembling hand against a rough pine, its bark scraping her skin, trying to suck in a breath that wasn't broken by sobs. The air was thin, biting. He will find me, the thought echoed, Silas's heavy, leering face swimming before her eyes. He said he would. The memory of his voice, thick with possessive rage, was a spur, driving her onward even as her legs threatened to buckle. She was a creature undone, stripped bare of hope, a fleeting, desperate shadow against the immense, unforgiving canvas of the wilderness. The scent of pine and damp earth was overwhelmed by the sharper, more primal smell of her own fear. Darkness was falling, not as a gentle blanket, but as a final, smothering threat. She stumbled into a shallow cleft between two great boulders, more by collapse than design. The wind howled over the opening, but here, at least, its direct assault was blunted. Ilara huddled, drawing her knees to her chest, arms wrapped tight in a futile attempt to conserve any lingering warmth. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably, a rhythm of pure misery. The fine dress she had worn for her wedding journey, a pale blue symbol of a hope so cruelly extinguished, offered no protection against the mountain's bitter breath. Silas had liked the color, he'd said. Then he'd torn at it in his rages. Fool, she berated herself, the word a silent scream in her mind. Such a blind, trusting fool. The advertisements had promised a new life, a respectable husband, a home. Instead, she had found a monster in a remote, desolate cabin, his eyes holding a cruelty she hadn't known could exist. Every creak of the timbers in that place, every heavy footfall, had been a prelude to pain or humiliation. Now, the silence of the mountains was almost as terrifying, filled with the unseen, the unknown. Hunger gnawed, a dull ache that intensified the chill. She closed her eyes, seeing not escape, but the sneering triumph on Silas's face when he dragged her back. The image was so vivid, so potent, it almost propelled her back out into the teeth of the wind. But her body was spent. The cold was a creeping numbness, a seductive whisper promising an end to suffering. She fought it, a tiny, flickering ember of defiance still glowing within. She had to. She had run from hell, she could not surrender to this frozen purgatory. The darkness was complete now, a palpable entity, and with it came the sounds of the night, the distant yowl of a predator, the rustle of unseen creatures. Each noise was a fresh spike of fear. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. Daylight, when it finally filtered grey and weak into her miserable refuge, brought no comfort, only a clearer view of her desolation. She was stiff, her limbs heavy and unresponsive, her throat raw. She had dozed fitfully, plagued by nightmares of Silas's hands, his voice. Rising was an agony. As she crawled from the crevice, the vast, snow-streaked panorama of the mountains struck her anew, not with awe, but with a crushing sense of her own insignificance. Then she saw him. He was downstream, by the thin ribbon of a frozen creek, still as the ancient pines that surrounded them. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, wrapped in furs and leather, his dark hair long and unconfined. He moved with a quiet grace that spoke of familiarity with this harsh land, his posture one of patient observation as he studied something on the ground. For a frozen moment, Ilara's heart simply stopped. Silas? Had he found her so quickly? But the build was different, leaner, more powerful, and there was none of Silas's brutish swagger. This man was part of the landscape, not an intruder upon it. He turned his head, slowly, as if sensing her gaze, and his eyes, dark and penetrating, met hers. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Elara. She scrambled backward, a small, desperate sound escaping her lips. He made no sudden move, no threatening gesture. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable, a mask of stoic composure. He was native, that much was clear from his features, his attire. A warrior, perhaps. Stories, ugly and fearful, whispered by folk in the settlement she'd passed through, flashed through her mind. But Silas was a known terror. This man was an unknown quantity in a world that had already proven its capacity for cruelty. He straightened, his movements fluid, economical. He held no weapon, or at least none she could see readily. He took a step towards the creek bank, then another, not directly at her, but in a way that didn't cut off her perceived escape route, if she'd had the strength for one. He bent, broke a sliver of ice from the creek's edge, and brought it to his lips. An ordinary action, yet it seemed to her fraught with an unspoken power. He was of this place. She was an intruder, a wounded animal run to ground. He approached her slowly, deliberately, his dark eyes missing nothing of her wretched state, the torn dress, the chapped skin, the visible tremor that shook her frame. Elara pressed herself against the cold stone, every instinct screaming at her to flee, yet her legs were leaden, useless. He stopped a few paces away, a respectful distance. The silence stretched, broken only by the whisper of the wind and her own ragged breathing. He was an imposing figure, clad in well-tanned hides that blended with the muted tones of the forest, a stark contrast to her own flimsy, inappropriate attire. He carried the scent of wood smoke and pine, a clean, wild smell. Finally, he spoke, his voice low, calm, not the harsh guttural sounds she might have imagined from the fearful tales, but resonant. The words were unfamiliar, not English. He gestured then, a slow movement of his hand towards her, then towards his own chest, and said a single word, Matu. He paused, then gestured to her, a questioning look in his eyes. She could only stare, fear and exhaustion rendering her mute. He seemed to understand. From a pouch at his belt, he produced a strip of dried meat and a small water skin. He held them out, palm up, an offering. Elara's gaze flickered from the food to his face, searching for any hint of deception, of threat. There was none she could discern, only a steady, unblinking regard. Hunger, a fierce, undeniable force, warred with her ingrained caution. Her stomach cramped painfully at the sight of the jerky. He nudged the items slightly forward, then set them on a flat rock between them and stepped back, giving her space. His consideration was a small, unexpected thing that chipped away at the outermost layer of her terror. Slowly, her trembling hand reached out. Her fingers closed around the cool leather of the water skin, then the rough texture of the meat. She did not look at him as she raised the skin to her cracked lips, the water an almost painful balm to her parched throat. He remained still, watching, a silent guardian or a patient captor, she could not yet tell which. He then gestured to the meager shelter she had found, and then to a plume of smoke rising faintly in the distance, higher up the wooded slope. A suggestion. An invitation? Mata led the way, not waiting for her explicit agreement, but moving at a pace she could just about manage. Each step was an effort, her bruised body protesting, but the distant promise of warmth, of a proper shelter from the relentless wind, was a powerful lure. He moved through the tangled undergrowth and over uneven terrain with an effortless, silent grace that shamed her clumsy progress. He did not offer a hand, but she sensed his awareness of her struggles, the slight pauses he made as if to allow her to catch up without overtly acknowledging her weakness. The camp was small, well concealed beneath an overhang of rock, shielded by a thick stand of aspens. A modest fire crackled in a carefully constructed pit, its tendrils of smoke cleverly dispersed by the rock face and trees. A simple lean-to of branches and hides offered further protection. It was a Spartan existence, yet it felt like a haven compared to the open hostility of the mountainside. Mata gestured for her to sit near the fire. The wave of warmth that washed over her was almost overwhelming, a physical sensation of relief so profound it brought tears to her eyes. She sank down onto a flattened piece of hide he indicated, her limbs trembling with a combination of cold, exhaustion, and residual fear. He added a few small branches to the fire, his movements economical and precise. He then took a gourd, dipped it into a pot simmering beside the flames, and offered it to her. A thin, hot broth, its aroma savory and inviting. She took it with shaking hands, the warmth seeping into her chilled fingers. He said nothing, retreating to the far side of the fire, busying himself with mending a piece of equipment, his presence a silent, watchful wait. Elara sipped the broth, its heat spreading through her, chasing away some of the deep, aching chill. She watched him from beneath lowered lashes. His face, in the flickering firelight, was stern, etched with lines that spoke of a hard life, yet there was no cruelty in it, not like Silas's. His eyes, when they briefly met hers, were dark and unreadable, but they held a certain gravity, a seriousness that was somehow reassuring. He was a man of the wilderness, self-sufficient, perhaps solitary. What did he want with her? Was she his prisoner? Or had he truly saved her out of some incomprehensible kindness? The question circled in her mind, but she was too weary, too broken, to voice them. For now, the fire was warm, the broth was sustenance, and the immediate threat of freezing to death had receded. That, in itself, was a miracle. Days bled into one another, marked by the rhythm of the sun and the slow, meticulous routine Mata maintained. He would leave for long periods, returning with fresh game, a rabbit, a brace of grouse, or foraged roots and berries she didn't recognize. He never asked her to help, but she began to watch, to learn. He showed her, with simple gestures, which plants were safe, how to bank the fire to conserve fuel, how to read the subtle signs of weather shifts in the clouds and wind. Her fear of him slowly began to recede, replaced by a wary curiosity, and then, grudgingly, by a nascent sense of security. He was a man of few words, his language largely incomprehensible to her, and hers to him. Yet, a strange sort of communication developed between them, built on observation, shared tasks, and the common enemy of the harsh environment. He would leave a piece of cooked meat for her, a skin of fresh water, before disappearing into the forest. He mended the tears in her flimsy dress with a strip of soft leather and sinew, his large hands surprisingly deft. He even fashioned a pair of rudimentary moccasins for her from a spare hide, noticing her painful struggles with the ill-suited slippers. These small acts of consideration, offered without expectation or comment, began to chip away at the wall of her despair. She saw the respect he held for the land, the way he moved through it as if an intrinsic part of its fabric. He took only what was needed, wasted nothing. This was so alien to Silas's greedy, destructive consumption of everything around him. One evening, a wolf pack howled close to their camp, the sound chillingly near. Elara froze, her heart leaping into her throat. Matu, without a word, simply rose, picked up his bow, and stood at the edge of the firelight, a silent, formidable protector. The howling faded into the distance. He returned to the fire, his composure unbroken, but she had seen the readiness in his stance, the fierce concentration in his eyes. He was dangerous, yes, but perhaps not to her. That night, for the first time since her escape, she slept without the paralyzing grip of terror, a fragile sense of safety nurtured by the quiet presence of the warrior across the fire. One morning, Mata returned to camp with a grim set to his jaw, his usual stoic calm subtly disturbed. He carried not game, but a small, mud-caked piece of cloth, a fragment of cheap calico, the kind favored by men in the outlying settlements. He held it out to Elara, his dark eyes fixed on hers, questioning. A cold dread seeped into her. She recognized the pattern, it was from a shirt one of Silas's brutish acquaintances often wore. Her breath hitched. Silas! He was looking for her. Or he had sent his cronies. The fragile piece she had begun to feel shattered. Mata watched her reaction, his gaze sharp. He needed no words to understand the source of her renewed fear. He made a gesture, sweeping his hand towards the lower valleys, then drew a finger across his throat, a clear indication of deadly threat. Then, he pointed towards the higher peaks, towards the deeper wilderness. The message was unmistakable, they had to move, and quickly. Elara's fear of Silas, a raw, visceral thing, surged back, almost choking her. But this time, it was different. It was no longer the paralyzing terror of a lone, helpless victim. She looked at Matu, at his steady, resolute face. He was not afraid, only prepared. A spark of her own resilience, long dormant, flickered to life. She would not be dragged back. She nodded, a single, decisive movement. She would go with him. The preparations were swift. Matu packed what little they had, dried meat, a few tools, the extra hides, with an efficiency that spoke of long practice. He doused the fire carefully, scattering the ashes, leaving little trace of their presence. Elara, clumsy but determined, helped as best she could, her earlier lethargy replaced by a nervous energy. The mountains, which had begun to feel like a grudging refuge, once again became a landscape of peril, but now she was not entirely alone in facing it. The silent warrior beside her was her only shield, her only hope against the relentless malice of the man she had fled. Their journey took them higher, into ever more rugged and unforgiving terrain. The air grew thinner, colder, and the wind cut with a sharper edge. Elara, though stronger than before, struggled to keep pace with Matu's tireless stride. Her lungs burned, her muscles ached, but she pushed on, driven by the fear of what lay behind and a growing, unspoken trust in the man who led the way. Matu, though he set a demanding pace, was not unmindful of her. He would find sheltered spots for their brief rests, share his meager rations without comment, and his eyes would often check her state, a flicker of concern in their dark depths that he quickly masked. He taught her more, by necessity. How to walk on loose scree without sending stones tumbling, how to find the easiest path across a swollen stream, how to identify the tracks of animals, both prey and predator. She learned to listen to the silence of the forest, to read the language of the wind. Her city softness was being stripped away, layer by layer, revealing an endurance she hadn't known she possessed. One evening, as a premature snow squall swirled around them, forcing them to take refuge in a shallow cave, they huddled close for warmth around a tiny, almost smokeless fire Matu managed to coax from damp twigs. The silence between them was no longer strained, but companionable, a shared understanding of their precarious existence. He offered her the larger share of the roasted bird he had managed to snare. She tried to refuse, but he insisted with a stern look. In that moment, looking at his weathered face, illuminated by the faint firelight, she saw not just a rescuer, but a fellow survivor. He had his own burdens, his own reasons for being an outsider in this vast wilderness, she sensed, though he never spoke of them. The fear of Silas still haunted her dreams, but in her waking hours, a new determination solidified. She would not merely survive, she would learn, she would adapt. She owed it to herself, and perhaps, in some small way, to the stoic warrior who had given her a chance she thought she'd lost forever. The confrontation, when it came, was as brutal and sudden as a mountain storm. They had been making their way through a narrow, wooded ravine when the ambush was sprung. Silas, his face contorted with rage and a possessive fury, stepped out from behind a thicket of pines, a long rifle in his hands. Two other men, rough-looking and equally menacing, flanked him. Well, well. Look what the Injun dragged in, Silas sneered, his eyes, cold and cruel, fixing on Elara. Thought you could run from me, did you, bitch? Elara froze, the blood turning to ice in her veins. All her newfound strength seemed to desert her. But Matu moved like lightning. In a blur of motion, he pushed Elara behind him, drawing the long knife from his belt. His stance was low, balanced, his eyes, no longer unreadable, now blazed with a cold, lethal fury. Stay out of this, savage, Silas spat, leveling his rifle. She's mine. The next moments were a chaotic explosion of violence. Matu did not wait for Silas to aim true. He lunged, not at Silas, but at the man to his left, deflecting a clumsy swing of a club and disabling him with a swift, brutal efficiency. The rifle shot cracked through the air, wild, the bullet thudding harmlessly into a tree trunk as Silas was momentarily startled. Elara, jolted from her terror by the nearness of death, screamed a warning as the third man lunged at Matu from the side with a hunting knife. Matu whirled, parrying the blow, the clang of steel echoing in the confined space. Silas, recovering, bellowed and charged with his rifle but Elara saw Matu stagger under the impact, but he recovered, his movements a deadly dance. She saw an opening, a desperate chance. Remembering the heavy rocks Mata had shown her could be used to grind seeds, she scrambled for one, her fingers closing around its rough weight. Silas was focused on Matu, raining blows. With a cry born of desperation and a fierce, protective instinct she hadn't known she possessed, Ilara hurled the rock with all her might. It struck Silas hard on the side of his head. He roared in pain and surprise, stumbling, his grip on the rifle loosening. That was all the opening Mata needed. He moved with blinding speed, disarming Silas, a final, decisive struggle ensuing. It ended with Silas on the ground, groaning, defeated, Mata standing over him, chest heaving, the bloody knife in his hand. The other two men, seeing their leader vanquished and Mata's deadly prowess, scrambled away into the woods, disappearing like frightened deer. Silence descended, heavy and profound, broken only by Silas's pained gasps and the ragged breathing of Matu and Ilara. Mata stood over Silas, his expression grim, the fury slowly receding from his eyes, replaced by a weary resolve. Silas, clutching his head, glared up with venomous hatred, but the fight was gone from him, replaced by fear. Mata nudged him with his foot, then spoke, not in his own tongue, but in broken, heavily accented English, the words hard as flint. She. Not. Yours. Go. Never return. He then retrieved Silas's rifle, emptied it, and threw it far into the undergrowth. He did not kill him, though Ilara knew he could have, easily. Perhaps it was a deeper wisdom, or a weariness of more killing. He simply turned his back on the whimpering man, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. Silas, after a moment, struggled to his feet, shot one last, fearful, hate-filled glance at them both, and then stumbled away, disappearing into the trees, a broken, pathetic figure. The immediate danger had passed. Ilara sagged against a tree, her legs trembling so violently she could barely stand. Reaction set in, a wave of nausea and dizziness. Mata came to her side. He was bleeding from a shallow cut on his arm, his breathing still labored. Without a word, she reached out, her fingers tracing the edge of the wound. He watched her, his dark eyes searching hers. In that moment, the vast cultural gulf between them, the unspoken words, the hardships endured, all coalesced into a single, powerful current of shared experience. She tore a strip from the hem of her already tattered dress, a garment that had once symbolized her bondage, now repurposed for an act of care. Her hands, though shaking, were surprisingly steady as she gently cleaned the cut with a little water from her skin and bound it. He allowed her ministration, his usual stoic reserve softened by a quiet acceptance. The silence that followed was not empty, but filled with a profound, unspoken understanding. He had saved her life, not once, but twice. And she, in her own small way, had stood with him. She looked at her hands, no longer the soft, unblemished hands of a naive mail-order bride, but roughened, capable. She had faced her monster, and with Mata's help, she had seen him defeated. A fragile, tentative peace settled over her. They did not linger in the ravine, the scene of the violent confrontation. Mata led them onward, deeper into the mountains, towards a place he seemed to know. The journey was slower now, more reflective. The fear of pursuit was gone, replaced by a quiet sense of liberation, though tinged with the weariness of all they had endured. Ilara walked beside him, no longer trailing, her steps more confident, her gaze more observant of the world around her. The harsh landscape, once a symbol of her terror and isolation, now began to reveal its hidden beauties, the resilience of a lone pine clinging to a cliff face, the unexpected blue of a mountain flower pushing through rocky soil, the soaring majesty of an eagle overhead. These were things Mata had always seen, she realized, and now, she was beginning to see them too. They finally reached it, a small, hidden valley, cupped within protective peaks, a clear stream meandering through it, aspen and pine dotting its gentle slopes. It felt untouched, a sanctuary. Here, Mata made a more permanent camp, a small, sturdy lodge built with skill and care. The days settled into a new rhythm, one of peace and quiet industry. Ilara found herself contributing, no longer a helpless burden, but a partner. She learned to gather wood, to prepare food, to mend hides. The sparse dialogue between them continued, but the understanding deepened, woven through shared tasks, quiet evenings by the fire, and mutual respect. She was no longer the terrified woman who had fled into the wilderness. The mountains had stripped her bare, then, through the unlikely intervention of a silent warrior, had shown her a strength she never knew she possessed. She had faced death, cruelty, and her deepest fears, and she had survived. More than survived, she had been reborn. The future was still an unwritten page, stretching out before her like the vast, open sky above their hidden valley. But now, it was a future she faced with a quiet courage, a resilient heart, and the steady, reassuring presence of Mata beside her. The wind still whispered through the pines, but its voice was no longer a threat, but a song of endurance, of a new beginning found in the most unexpected of places.